It is to be our privilege to take part in the greatest amphibious operation in history, a necessary preliminary to the opening of the Western Front in Europe, which, in conjunction with the great Russian advance, will crush the fighting power of Germany. This is the opportunity which we have long awaited, and which must be seized and pursued with relentless determination. The hopes and prayers of the free world and of the enslaved peoples of Europe will be with us, and we cannot fail them. Our task, in conjunction with the merchant navies of the United Nations and supported by the Allied air forces, is to carry the Allied expeditionary force to the continent, to establish it there in a secure bridgehead, and to build it up and maintain it at a rate that will outmatch that of the enemy. Let no one underestimate the magnitude of this work.
The message was written by Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay on May 31st, 1944. The task was launching perhaps the biggest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, the success or failure of which would likely decide the outcome of the Second World War. 6 days later, on D-Day, after years of top-secret planning, Ramsay was in overall command of Operation Neptune as more than 4,000 ships and landing craft, nearly 200,000 men, and thousands of aircraft took part in the first wave of Normandy landings. 70 years on, and Admiral Ramsay has become D-Day's forgotten commander. His pivotal role in organising what one historian described as a never-surpassed masterpiece of planning is largely overlooked.
And the guns of the Navy were tearing gaps into the steel and concrete walls of Fortress Europe. For the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and for Admiral Ramsay in command of the Allied fleet, these were anxious hours.
Ramsay was prepared to sit down and to work with the Army and to work with the Air Force and to work in support of the Army and the Air Force. And he was also prepared to work with Eisenhower and the American commanders. So it's his planning abilities, but it's also his team-working abilities that make him the right man for the right moment. My name's Alan Packwood, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge, home to the papers of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. Admiral Ramsay actually had a really interesting and quite different career path. He works underneath Eisenhower in the Operation Torch to liberate North Africa in 1942, coordinating the naval side of those landings, and he goes on to develop that and to take that into the invasion of Sicily in 1943. So that by the time you get to D-Day, by the time you get to June 1944, he has established himself as the go-to man for these complex naval operations, although of course nothing he had yet done was as complex as D-Day itself. I mean, the thing that you need to remember about D-Day, that you need to remember about Operation Overlord, is this is an absolutely enormous exercise. Ramsay's task is to coordinate over 1,000 fighting ships and transports and to make sure that they get to the right place at the right time, not just on D-Day, but at H hour. I think one of the problems that we have when thinking about D-Day and Operation Overlord now is that we know that they succeeded. And of course, the commanders in the day did not have that foreknowledge. They could do everything that they could to prepare, but this was still a huge gamble. We were putting all of our eggs in one basket. What would have happened if the Allied forces had been repulsed from the Normandy beaches in early June 1944? Winston Churchill, General Eisenhower, Admiral Ramsay, they were all aware of what was riding on this. And that's clear from Ramsay's diary and his letters. What we have here is Admiral Ramsay's diary for 1944, and it's open on the entry for Monday the 5th of June, the eve of the invasion. And here you can see Ramsay confiding in his diary.
I am under no delusions as to the risks involved in this most difficult of all operations, and the critical period around HR when, if initial flights are held up, success will be in the balance.
So I don't know whether Ramsay got any sleep that night, but he did retire to bed. I think to do anything else would have been to show panic. And here we are then on the following morning on D-Day. And he writes,
I was called at 0500 and not before, which meant that nothing bad had happened, or I should have been called. The sky was clear, thank God, so that night, dawn and day bombing was going well. Everything remarkably good, and better than we could have expected, but we still have to establish ourselves on land. We have very much to thank God for this day.
At a recent symposium held at Churchill College to commemorate D-Day's forgotten architect, the star speaker was 90-year-old former Wren Fanny Hugill, who was part of Ramsay's command team in the run-up to and during D-Day.
Due to the postponement of D-Day, I found myself on watch for the night watch of 5th, 6th June. That was from 11 p.m. on the 5th till 8 a.m. on the 6th. On that particular night, the weather was dreadful. Above the shutters you could hear the sound of the drone of the aircraft going overhead, and the Armada crossing the Channel to France. I think that the abiding memory is of his leadership. He was not one to sort of have a drink in the pub with the chaps. He wasn't like that at all. He could be a little bit austere, but we trusted him and he trusted us. We knew what we had to do. We gave him our total loyalty.
Courcelles, Saint-Aubin, Langrune, Ouistreham, Port-en-Bessin, Saint-Vaast, Aramanche. Remember these names, for there the fate of civilization was being settled between men and men, machine and machine, in the shallow ditches and the muddy sea.
There's no doubt that Ramsay played an extremely significant role in the Second World War. He was a major participant in several major operations. There's the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, the landings in North Africa in 1942, Sicily in 1943, and then D-Day in 1944. The problem, I think, for historians is that Ramsay tragically died in a plane crash in January 1945. And that meant, of course, that he was not in a position to talk about his role or to write about his role. And I think that meant inevitably that over time his voice and his role tended to be subordinated to the other major players. I think it's wonderful to be able, on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, to focus again on Admiral Ramsay. You can see this concern, this responsibility captured in the contemporary records, in the diaries and letters of Churchill and Ramsay and others. And I think that's wonderful, because what it does is to restore their humanity to the picture. At the end of the day, these were ordinary people struggling with incredible events. And to my mind, it does not diminish them to see them as human.